Ronald didn't even look back when his carriage dumped Daisy at the rotting gates of Ashbourne. She was 22, her leg shattered from a carriage accident he had caused, and entirely useless to a duke who required physical perfection. He thought he was burying a broken wife in a Yorkshire mud pit, leaving her with 3 sway-backed mares and a mountain of debt. 5 years later, Ronald returned to demand the deed. Instead, he found the King's Royal Guard at her door. The rain in Yorkshire did not fall. It drove. It drove horizontally across the moors, stinging like buckshot against the windows of the hired hackney. Daisy clutched the mahogany handle of her cane. Her knuckles were white. The cane was a cruel, heavy thing, ordered by her husband's physician. It had a brass handle shaped like a hound's head. Every jolt of the carriage sent a sickening shockwave up her right leg, radiating from the poorly set bone in her thigh, straight into her spine. She did not cry. Crying was for the drawing rooms of Mayfair, where tears could be dried with lace handkerchiefs and rewarded with pity. There was no one to pity her here. The carriage lurched to a halt, the wheels sinking deep into thick, suctioning mud. The driver shouted something unintelligible over the wind, jumped down, and yanked the door open. "Ashbourne stud, your grace," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. He was soaked to the bone and eager to be rid of her. Daisy leaned heavily on the cane and pulled herself to the door. She didn't wait for the folding steps. She half stepped, half fell into the mud. The cold wetness instantly soaked through her thin leather boots. She gripped the side of this carriage to steady herself, her breath catching in her throat as the agonizing familiar fire flared in her hip. She looked up. Ashbourne. Ronald had described it as a rustic retreat for her convalescence. That was a lie. Ronald only spoke in lies wrapped in velvet. Ashbourne was a corpse of an estate. The main house was a sprawling, asymmetrical stone monstrosity with half its slate roof missing. Ivy choked the brickwork, not the romantic sort of ivy, but the thick, parasitic kind that pulled mortar from stone. Beyond the house, the stables loomed, a massive quadrangle of timber and slate that looked as though it might collapse under the weight of the relentless rain. The driver unstrapped her 2 modest trunks, dropping them unceremoniously into the muck. He tipped his hat, scrambled back onto his bench, and whipped the horses. Daisy was left entirely alone in the driveway. No housekeeper rushed out with an umbrella. No stable boy came to take her bags. There was only the sound of the wind, the rain, and the distant panicked whinny of a horse. Daisy gritted her teeth. She dragged her left foot forward, then swung the right, leaning her weight onto the brass hound's head. Step, drag, step, drag. It took her 10 minutes to reach the heavy oak front door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Mildew, rat droppings, and damp ash. The grand foyer was stripped bare. Faded rectangles on the wallpaper showed where paintings had once hung. The carpets were gone. A single, overturned wooden chair lay near the grand staircase. "Hello?" Her voice echoed, thin and reedy, swallowed by the cavernous damp. A shadow detached itself from the hallway leading to the kitchens. A man limped forward. He was old, his face weathered like cured tobacco, wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better decades. He stopped a few paces from her, taking in her sodden silk travelling gown, the heavy cane, and her twisted posture. "You'll be the Duchess then," he said. His voice was gravel. There was no bow, no deference. "I am Daisy Pendleton," she replied, keeping her chin level despite the tremor in her good leg. "And you are?" "Higgins. I manage the horses, or what's left of them." He looked her up and down again, a blunt, cynical appraisal. "The Duke's letter said you were coming to rest, said you was an invalid." "The Duke is deeply misinformed about many things," Daisy said coldly. "Are you the only staff?" "Just me and a boy, Pip. Cook left a fortnight ago when the wages stopped coming. The Duke's man came through last month, sold off all the furniture worth a damn, sold the good stallions, left us with 3 barren mares and a blind pony. Said the estate was to be shuttered." Higgins spat into the unlit fireplace. "Then we get a letter saying you're arriving." It clicked. A cold, hard realization settled in Daisy's chest, freezing over the last remnants of the naive girl who had married Ronald Pendleton 3 years ago. Ronald hadn't just sent her away because her limp embarrassed him at Almack's. He hadn't just exiled her because she could no longer dance the waltz or walk gracefully through his manicured gardens. He had sent her to a bankrupt, stripped, rotting property with no staff and no money. He had sent her here to die. A bad winter, a chest infection, a slip on the steep stairs. It would be a tragic, convenient end to a defective wife, leaving him free to marry a new, unbroken bride. "Where are my trunks?" Higgins asked, breaking the silence. "In the mud at the end of the drive," Daisy said. Higgins sighed, a deep, tired sound. "I'll fetch 'em. There's a bed in the master suite. It's got no curtains, but the mattress is dry. I'll have Pip bring up some firewood. But I'll tell you now, Your Grace. There's no food in the larder. Only oats and a half sack of potatoes." "Then we will eat potatoes, Mr. Higgins." He paused at the door, glancing back at her. For a fraction of a second, surprise flickered in his cloudy eyes. Then he nodded, pulling his collar up against the rain, and stepped out into the storm. Daisy stood alone in the empty hall. Her legs screamed in agony. The damp cold was already seeping into her marrow. She closed her eyes, letting the physical pain wash over her, letting it burn away the grief. She thought of Ronald, sitting in his velvet-lined club in St. James, sipping brandy, already forgetting her face. She opened her eyes. The tears were gone. In their place was a hard, furious clarity. "You want me to rot, Ronald?" she thought, gripping the cane until her fingers bruised. "I will make this ruin a fortress, and I will make you choke on it." Winter hit Ashbourne like a physical blow. By November, the moors were locked in frost, the mud freezing into treacherous, jagged ruts. Daisy stopped wearing dresses. They dragged in the dirt, caught on nails, and disguised the uneven terrain beneath her feet, causing her to fall. After her third bad fall, which left her with a bruised cheek and a bleeding elbow, she dragged a pair of Higgins's old canvas trousers and a heavy wool coat from the servants' quarters. She took a pair of shears to her own hair, hacking away the long golden curls Ronald had once praised, leaving a choppy, practical crop that wouldn't blow into her eyes. When Higgins first saw her limp into the stables wearing men's clothes, covered in a heavy oilskin, he dropped his pitchfork. "You look like a vagrant, Your Grace," he grunted. "I am warm, Higgins, and I can move." She grabbed a bucket of oats. "Which stall?" The first few months had been a brutal education in survival. Daisy had stripped her jewellery box. The pearl necklace paid for winter feed. The sapphire earrings bought a flock of chickens, a dairy cow, and coal. The diamond engagement ring, which she sold with a vicious sense of satisfaction to a jeweller in York, paid for repairs to the stable roof and back wages for Higgins and Pip. She did not sit by the fire. The fire was for the evenings when she would sit with the estate ledgers poring over decades of Ashbourne's breeding records. The Pendletons had once bred the finest cavalry horses in the north. Ronald's father had been a master horseman. Ronald had ruined it all in 5 years to pay his gambling debts. During the day, Daisy lived in the stables. She learned that horses did not care if you were a duchess. They did not care if you had a limp. They responded to a steady hand, a calm voice, and the smell of oats. One brutal night in late January, the wind was howling so loudly the timber beams of the stables groaned. Daisy was awakened in her freezing bedroom by frantic banging on the front door. It was Pip, the 14-year-old stable boy. He was blue with cold, his eyes wide with panic. "It's Nellie, Mum. She's foaling early. Higgins says it's bad." Daisy didn't hesitate. She shoved her feet into her boots, threw her wool coat over her nightgown, grabbed her cane, and followed the boy out into the blizzard. The wind whipped the snow into her face, blinding her. She slipped on the ice, her bad leg giving out. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding in her hip. Pip turned back, reaching out a hand. "Your Grace, go!" she barked, spitting snow from her mouth. She used the cane to lever herself up, ignoring the nausea rolling in her stomach, and forced her legs to move. Step, drag, step, drag. Inside the foaling stall, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and panic. Nellie, one of the 3 barren mares that hadn't turned out to be barren after all, was thrashing on the straw. Her sides heaved with exhaustion. Higgins was kneeling behind her, his arms buried to the elbows in the mare, his face pale and slick with sweat. "What is it?" Daisy demanded, dropping her cane and falling to her knees in the soiled straw. "Breach," Higgins grunted, his voice tight with strain. "He's coming backward, and a leg is caught on her pelvis. I can't reach the joint to turn him. My arms are too thick." The mare let out a horrific, high-pitched scream and slammed her head against the wooden boards. "She's dying," Pip whimpered from the corner. "Shut up, Pip," Daisy snapped. She looked at Higgins. "Show me." Higgins stared at her. "Your Grace, this ain't for a lady. It's bloody, and she might kick your head clean off. I am not a lady, Higgins. I am the owner of this farm, and I cannot afford to lose this mare or this foal. Get out of the way." She stripped off her heavy wool coat, leaving her in her thin nightgown. She rolled up her sleeves. The freezing air in the stable raised goosebumps on her flesh, but she barely felt it. She knelt behind the thrashing mare. "Guide my hand," she ordered. Higgins swallowed, then nodded. "Go in slow. Find the chest, then trace down to the left. You'll feel the knee joint. It's wedged hard. You have to push the foal back in, fold the leg, and pull it forward." Daisy took a breath, the stench of manure and blood filling her lungs, and plunged her arm into the mare. It was hot, slick, and impossibly tight. The mare contracted, the muscles clamping down around Daisy's arm like a vice, crushing her flesh against her own bone. Daisy cried out, tears of sheer physical pain springing to her eyes. Hold on, Higgins murmured, keeping a heavy hand on the mare's flank. "Let the contraction pass." The pressure eased slightly. Daisy pushed deeper. She closed her eyes, relying entirely on touch. She felt a rib cage. She slid her fingers down, navigating the slick, wet darkness. There, a hard knob of bone, the knee. It was jammed brutally against the mare's pelvic bone. "I have it," she gasped. "Push him back. You have to create space." Daisy braced her good leg in the straw, gritted her teeth, and shoved. Her shoulder screamed. The mare fought her, bearing down. For a terrifying minute, it was a battle of pure will between a broken woman and a dying horse. Daisy dug her nails into her own palms, channeling every ounce of rage she had for Ronald, for the cold house, for the phantom pain in her leg, into her arm. Move. The foal slid backward an inch. It was enough. Daisy twisted her hand, cupped the tiny, sharp hoof, folded the knee and pulled it forward into the birth canal. "Clear!" she yelled. "Pull!" Higgins shouted. Daisy grabbed the slippery front legs. Higgins grabbed her waist from behind to anchor her. The mare gave one final, earth-shattering heave. With a sickening, wet rush, the foal slid out, collapsing into Daisy's lap in a tangle of limbs, membrane, and fluid. Daisy fell backward into the dirt, gasping for air. She was covered from chest to knees in blood and afterbirth. Her hands were shaking violently. Higgins scrambled forward, tearing the sack away from the foal's muzzle. He cleared the airway with 2 fingers. A second later, the tiny colt took a rattling breath, shook its head, and let out a weak whinny. Higgins sat back on his heels. He looked at the foal, then looked over at Daisy. She was sitting in the muck, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, staring at her blood-soaked hands. "Well, I'll be damned," Higgins whispered softly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a relatively clean rag, and offered it to her. "You've got a good touch, Bee." It was the first time he hadn't called her Your Grace. Daisy took the rag, a fierce, feral grin breaking across her exhausted face. She looked at the long, sturdy legs of the colt trying to untangle itself in the straw. "We are going to breed him, Higgins," she said, her voice raspy but hard as iron. "We are going to breed him, and we are going to sell his offspring for a fortune. 3 years is a long time in the country. It is enough time for a broken bone to ache only when it rains. It is enough time for calluses to turn smooth, soft hands into sandpaper. And it is enough time to rebuild a bloodline, provided one has the sheer bloody-minded ruthlessness to do it. By the spring of her 4th year at Ashbourne, the roof of the main house was repaired. The stables smelled of fresh pine shavings and expensive alfalfa. The 3 barren mares had yielded 3 exceptional foals. The colt Daisy had pulled from the mud, now a towering, ill-tempered, magnificent grey stallion named Vengeance, was the pride of the county, but pride did not pay the grain merchants. They were breeding good horses, but they lacked the capital to scale the operation. They needed a massive influx of cash. They needed a government contract. Captain James Linfield did not want to be in Yorkshire. He was a cavalry officer, a veteran of Waterloo, and currently acting as a remount buyer for the Crown. His job was to scour the countryside for horses strong enough to carry the King's dragoons. It was a tedious, mud-soaked task that usually involved haggling with stubbornly greedy squires over knock-kneed geldings. When his ledger directed him to Ashbourne Stud, owned by the Duke of Westford, Linfield had sneered. He knew Westford, an arrogant fop who wouldn't know a fetlock from a forelock. He expected to find a ruined vanity project. He rode his heavy hunter through the gates and stopped. The estate was austere, lacking the ornamental gardens popular with the nobility, but it was immaculately kept. The fences were reinforced with thick, raw timber. The paddocks were a lush, vibrant green, and the horses grazing in them made Linfield pull sharp on his reins. They were spectacular. Deep-chested, short-backed, with powerful hindquarters built for sudden, explosive speed. He trotted toward the main stable-yard, dismounting. He expected a pompous estate manager to greet him. Instead, he saw a woman standing in the centre of the yard. She was brushing down a massive grey stallion. She wore tall, leather riding boots, canvas trousers, and a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her hair was tied back in a short, practical knot. As she moved around the horse, Linfield noticed a severe, distinct limp. She favoured her right leg heavily, moving with a rhythmic, rolling gait that compensated for a ruined hip. Yet, she handled the massive, nervous stallion with an effortless, quiet authority. Linfield cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I am looking for the estate manager." The woman paused. She patted the stallion's neck, handed the brush to a young stable hand, and turned to face him. She picked up a brass-handled cane leaning against the stall door. Linfield took a step back, surprised by the sudden, intense intelligence in her pale grey eyes. She didn't look like a peasant, despite the dirt on her cheek. "I am the owner," she said, her voice crisp and educated. "Daisy Pendleton. How may I help the Crown today, Captain?" She had read his uniform instantly. Linfield blinked. "Pendleton, you are the Duchess of Westford?" "I am the proprietor of Ashbourne Stud," she corrected smoothly, leaning lightly on the cane. Her gaze swept over his mud-splattered uniform. "And you are looking for remounts, heavy cavalry, judging by your own mount. You need bone, stamina, and a quiet temperament under fire." Linfield felt a smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. "You know your trade, Your Grace." "Yes, I am Captain James Linfield. I need 50 head by autumn. But looking at your paddocks, you don't breed heavy draft crosses. You breed hot bloods." "I breed survivors," Daisy said softly. She gestured with her free hand toward the paddocks. "They are thoroughbred crosses. You think they are too light for the dragoons? I think a cannon blast would send them running back to London," Linfield said bluntly. Daisy didn't flinch. She liked this man's lack of deference. He didn't stare at her cane with pity, nor did he look at her title with awe. He looked at the horses. "Pip," Daisy called out. "Saddle Vengeance." Linfield raised an eyebrow. "You're going to ride?" "Don't be absurd, Captain. I would fall off." She smiled, and it was a sharp, dangerous expression. "You are going to ride." 10 minutes later, Linfield found himself atop the grey stallion. The horse felt like a coiled spring of pure muscle beneath him. "Take him to the far fence line," Daisy instructed, standing by the gate with Higgins. "And when you reach the oak tree, fire your sidearm." Linfield stared at her. "He'll bolt. If he bolts, I will give him to you for free." Linfield adjusted his grip on the reins, spurred the horse, and took off. The acceleration was terrifying. The stallion moved with a brutal, ground-eating stride. As he neared the oak tree, Linfield drew his cavalry pistol. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, bracing for the inevitable buck, and fired into the air. Crack. Vengeance didn't break stride. His ears flicked back toward Linfield, acknowledging the sound, but his pace remained smooth, powerful, and utterly controlled. Linfield wheeled the horse around and cantered back to the yard. He was breathing hard, a flush of pure adrenaline in his cheeks. He dismounted, staring at the grey horse in reverence. He didn't even flinch, Linfield breathed. How? We don't break our horses, Captain Linfield, Daisy said, leaning on her cane. We teach them to trust us. A horse that trusts its rider will run into hellfire. A horse that fears its rider will flee at the first loud noise. Linfield looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dirt under her fingernails, the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, and the rigid, painful set of her shoulders. He saw a woman who had been broken, discarded, and had rebuilt herself from the mud up. I can't buy him, Linfield said, his voice dropping. The Crown budget won't allow for a horse of this caliber as a standard remount. I am not selling vengeance, Daisy replied. He is my foundation, sire. But I will sell you 20 of his half-brothers. £300 a head, Linfield choked. 300? The Crown pays 40 for a cavalry mount. The Crown pays 40 for meat that gets your men killed at the first volley, Daisy said coldly. If you want mounts that will keep your officers alive, you will pay 300, and you will tell the master of the horse exactly where you got them. Linfield stared at her. He should walk away. It was extortion. It was unprecedented. He looked at this grey stallion. He looked back at the fierce, unyielding woman leaning on her brass-headed cane. 250, Linfield said, and I want first refusal on next year's foals. Daisy held out a calloused, dirty hand. Done, Captain. As Linfield shook her hand, feeling the surprising strength in her grip, he realised two things. First, he had just secured the finest horses the British Army would ever see. Second, Ronald Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, was an absolute fool. Ronald Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, stared at the pale rectangular shadow on the silk wallpaper of his Mayfair study. A portrait of his grandfather used to hang there. It had been sold on Tuesday. The bailiffs had come quietly, out of respect for his title, but they had been thorough. The silver candelabras were gone. The Persian rugs were rolled up and carted away. The mahogany desk Ronald sat behind was only still there because it was too wide to fit through the door without unhinging it, a task the men promised to return for on Monday. Ronald poured himself a glass of gin from a chipped crystal decanter. The cheap liquor burned his throat. He hated gin. It tasted like poverty. His solicitor, Mr. Finch, sat on the single remaining chair in the room, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Finch was a small, nervous man who smelled faintly of old paper and peppermint. He coughed into his fist. The sum total is £80,000, Your Grace, Finch said, his voice a dry rustle. Lord Harrington holds the majority of your promissory notes. He is no longer accepting delays. He threatens debtor's prison. Ronald set the glass down hard. A duke does not go to debtor's prison, Finch. It is uncouth. A duke who cannot pay his gambling debts to a man as vicious as Harrington might, Finch corrected gently. We have liquidated the London properties. We have sold the hunting lodge in Kent. We are out of assets. Ronald dragged a hand over his face. He was 32, but the mirror showed a man a decade older. His striking aristocratic features were bloated from brandy. His eyes bloodshot, his skin pale and sallow. He had spent 5 years chasing the thrill of the faro tables and the betting rings at Newmarket, convinced his luck would turn. It never did. There is nothing left, Ronald asked, the edge of panic finally bleeding into his voice. Finch adjusted his spectacles. There is Ashbourne, Ronald blinked. The name sounded foreign to him. It took a moment for his gin-soaked brain to conjure the image of the sprawling, rotting estate in Yorkshire. Ashbourne is a mud pit, Ronald sneered. The house was falling apart 5 years ago. I stripped it of anything valuable before I sent... He stopped. He hadn't spoken his wife's name aloud in years. Before you sent her grace to convalesce, Finch finished tactfully. Yes, however, the land itself holds value. There is a booming textile industry in York. Several mill owners are desperate for grazing land for their heavy draft teams, and there are water rights on the eastern boundary. We could sell the deed for perhaps 10,000. It would be enough to placate Harrington and secure a passage to the continent until your fortunes improve. Ronald stared at the glass. 10,000. It was a pittance, an insult to his family name, but it was survival. And my wife? Ronald asked lightly, feigning indifference. Finch looked down at his ledger. We have received no correspondence from Ashbourne in 4 years, Your Grace. The quarterly allowance you authorized was suspended 3 years ago due to lack of funds. I cannot speak to Her Grace's current condition. Ronald felt a brief, dark flicker of hope. 4 years in a rotting, unheated house with a shattered leg and no money. Yorkshire winters were notoriously brutal. It was entirely possible the problem of Daisy had solved itself. If she were dead, the legal proceedings would be infinitely simpler. If she were alive, she would simply be evicted. She was entirely dependent on him. She had no family left to object, and the law was clear. A wife's property, her residence, her very existence, belonged to her husband. Draw up the papers, Finch, Ronald said, standing up. He felt a sudden surge of energy, the desperate adrenaline of a cornered animal finding an exit. I will travel to Yorkshire tomorrow. I will secure her signature if she still breathes, or her death certificate if she does not. Harrington will have his money by the end of the month. The journey north took 4 grueling days. The carriage Ronald hired was sprung poorly, rattling his teeth and jarring his spine. The rain began somewhere around Nottingham and did not cease. As he stared out the mud-splattered window, Ronald justified his cruelty. Daisy had brought it upon herself. She had been a beautiful bride, a perfect ornament for his arm, until that carriage accident. He conveniently suppressed the memory of his own reckless driving, the excessive speed he had demanded of his horses while thoroughly drunk, which had tipped their phaeton into a ditch. He only remembered how she had screamed. He remembered the physician shaking his head, declaring she would never walk normally again. She had become an embarrassment, a limping, crippled reminder of his one mistake. Society demanded physical perfection from its apex predators, and Daisy had become prey. He had done her a favor, really, sending her to the country away from the whispers of the Tarn. The carriage finally turned onto the road leading to Ashbourne. Ronald braced himself for the sight of the ruined gates. He intended to be in and out within the hour. Grab the deed, deal with the woman, and leave. Ronald leaned forward as the carriage ground to a halt. He frowned, wiping the condensation from the glass. The driver had made a mistake. The gates standing before him were not the rotting, sagging timbers he had left behind. These were massive, imposing structures of freshly forged black iron, anchored to pristine brick pillars. A freshly painted sign hung from the stonework. Ashbourne Royal Stud. Before Ronald could rap his cane on the roof to correct the driver, 2 men stepped out from a newly built gatehouse. Ronald's breath caught in his throat. They were not local toughs or hired watchmen. They wore the brilliant scarlet tunics, white crossbelts, and plumed shakos of the king's heavy dragoons. One of the soldiers stepped to the carriage window, a standard-issue brown Bess musket resting casually but deliberately against his shoulder. "State your business," the dragoon ordered. His accent was thick Yorkshire, but his discipline was military iron. Ronald rolled down the window, indignation flushing his pale cheeks. "I am the Duke of Westford. You are standing on my property. Open these gates immediately." The soldier didn't blink. He looked at Ronald, then at a clipboard hanging by the gatehouse. "We have no notice of a duke. This is a Crown-contracted facility. No entry without authorization from the proprietor or the Ministry of War." "I am the proprietor, you insubordinate peasant," Ronald shouted, his temper flaring. "This is my land, my estate." The second dragoon stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his bayonet. "You'll lower your voice, sir. I don't care if you're the Pope. We take our orders from Captain Linfield and the Duchess. Now state your business, or turn the carriage around." Ronald's mind reeled. The Duchess. Daisy. She was alive, and she somehow had the King's dragoons acting as her personal gatekeepers. "I am the Duchess's husband," Ronald hissed through clenched teeth. "Send word to the house. Tell her the Duke has arrived." The soldiers exchanged a look. The first one nodded slowly. "Wait here." Ronald sat in the carriage for 20 humiliating minutes. The rain drummed relentlessly on the roof. He watched, seething, as perfectly matched pairs of massive, gleaming horses were led across the distant paddocks by well-fed, sharply dressed stable hands. The fences were tight. The pastures were manicured. Ashbourne did not look like a mud pit. It looked like a fortress of wealth. Finally, the iron gates swung open. The carriage rolled slowly up the crushed limestone drive. Ronald stepped out into the drizzle, his expensive leather boots crunching on the stone. The main house took his breath away. The ivy had been painstakingly cleared. The stonework had been repointed. The roof was flawless slate. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, smelling of expensive coal, not the damp wood of poverty. He marched toward the massive oak front doors, ready to kick them open. Before he could reach them, they swung outward. A man stepped onto the portico. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the immaculately tailored uniform of a cavalry captain. His boots shone like black glass. He looked down at Ronald with an expression of profound, quiet contempt. "Duke Westford," Captain Linfield said, his voice a low rumble. "We were not expecting you." "Get out of my way," Ronald spat, trying to push past the officer. Linfield didn't move. He simply stood like a stone wall. "You will mind your manners, Your Grace. You are a guest here. I own this house. Ronald." The voice came from the shadows of the foyer. It was cold, clear, and steady. It did not hold a trace of the timid, weeping girl he had abandoned 5 years ago. Linfield stepped aside. Daisy stood in the doorway. Ronald stared. He could not reconcile the woman before him with the wife he had discarded. Her hair was cropped short, framing a face that had lost its soft, girlish curves and hardened into sharp, arresting angles. Her skin was tanned by the wind and sun. She wore a tailored wool riding jacket over dark trousers. Scandalous attire for a lady, but she wore it like armor. Her right hand rested heavily on the brass hound's head of her cane. She leaned into it, unabashedly favoring her ruined leg. She did not try to hide her limp. She owned it. "Daisy," Ronald managed, his voice betraying a flicker of shock. "What is this? What have you done?" "I have survived," Daisy said evenly. She did not invite him inside. She stood on the threshold, looking down at him on the wet gravel. "It is a habit you vastly underestimated." "The soldiers at the gate," Ronald demanded, regaining his bluster. "The horses, by whose authority?" "By the authority of the Crown," Captain Linfield interjected smoothly. "Ashbourne is the primary remount supplier for the King's heavy dragoons. The garrison is here to protect a vital military asset." Ronald barked a harsh, desperate laugh. "I don't care if you breed winged Pegasi for the Archangel Gabriel. The land is mine. The law is clear. A wife cannot own property or operate a business without her husband's consent. Whatever contracts you've signed are null and void." He pulled a rolled parchment from his coat pocket, waving it like a weapon. "I have come for the deed, Daisy. I am selling the estate. You will pack your things." Daisy didn't flinch. She looked at the parchment, then looked at Ronald. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It reached her eyes, turning them into chips of grey ice. "Higgins," she called out, not taking her eyes off her husband. The old stablemaster emerged from the hallway. He looked hale and hearty, wearing a fine wool waistcoat. He carried a heavy, iron-bound lockbox. He set it down on a table in the foyer, opened it with a heavy key, and withdrew a thick stack of papers. He handed them to Daisy. "The law is indeed clear, Ronald," Daisy said softly. "A wife cannot own property, but a wife's debts, and the debts of her husband, can be purchased by a third party." She tossed the stack of papers onto the gravel at Ronald's feet. Ronald looked down. He saw his own signature, scrawled drunkenly at the bottom of dozens of promissory notes. He saw the seal of Lord Harrington. He saw the debts from the faro tables, the unpaid tailoring bills, the carriage makers. "What is this?" Ronald whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. "Captain Linfield is not just a cavalry officer," Daisy explained, her voice ringing like a bell in the damp air. "He acts as an agent for the Crown Treasury. When I secured the contract to supply the King's army, I did not ask for cash up front. I asked for a favour." Linfield stepped forward. "Her Grace asked me to locate your creditors in London. The Crown purchased your debt, Your Grace, every single pound of it, and then the Crown transferred those notes to a private holding company." "A company," Daisy said, leaning heavily on her cane, her chin raised, "that I control completely through an ironclad trust. You owe Lord Harrington nothing, Ronald." Ronald let out a breath he didn't realise he was holding. A hysterical laugh escaped his throat. "You bought my debt? You fool! You saved me!" Daisy's smile vanished. Her eyes went dead. "I didn't save you, Ronald. I bought you." She pointed the brass head of her cane at his chest. "You owe me £80,000. Due immediately." Ronald's laughter sounded like a carriage wheel splintering on cobblestones. It was harsh, breathless, and entirely hollow. He looked from his wife to the stack of sodden promissory notes bleeding ink into the gravel, then to the imposing dragoon captain. "You are bluffing," Ronald sneered, though a tremor had entered his voice. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Daisy. "You are a woman, a married woman under English law. You cannot hold a trust. You cannot own debt. Any asset you acquire belongs to me. I am your husband. I am the Duke of Westford." Captain Linfield stepped off the portico, the heavy brass spurs on his boots clinking over the gravel. He did not look angry. He looked bored. "You really should have paid more attention to your legal history, Your Grace," Linfield said, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur that cut through the sound of the rain. "Under the common law, yes, a wife is property, but under the courts of chancery, a woman may hold an equitable estate in trust, provided the trustees are male, of age, and not her husband, and provided the trust was established before the assets were acquired." Ronald's stomach plummeted. He looked at Linfield's immaculate uniform. "You?" "Myself, the Quartermaster General, and Lord Arrington of the Exchequer," Linfield confirmed. "3 officers of the Crown. We are the trustees of the Ashbourne Foundation. The Foundation bought your debts from Harrington. The Foundation breeds these horses, and the Foundation allows the Duchess to manage the operation as its primary beneficiary." Linfield smiled, a thin, wolfish expression. "You do not own a single horseshoe on this property, Ronald, and your wife holds the leash to your neck." Ronald felt the blood drain from his face. The cold rain was seeping through his expensive wool coat, chilling him to the bone. But he felt a different kind of freezing dread spreading in his chest. Harrington had promised him debtor's prison, a filthy, disease-ridden cell in the Fleet. If Daisy held the notes, she could summon the bailiffs today. She could have him in chains before the sunset. "You bitch," Ronald breathed. He lunged. It was a pathetic, uncoordinated movement born of sheer drunken panic. He reached for her throat. He didn't make it up the first step. Linfield moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who had killed cavalrymen in close combat. He grabbed Ronald by the lapels of his coat, pivoted on his heel, and slammed the Duke back into the side of the hired carriage. The impact knocked the wind out of Ronald in a violent whoosh. Linfield's forearm pressed hard against Ronald's windpipe, pinning him to the damp wood. The 2 dragoons at the gatehouse instantly snapped their muskets level, the metal mechanisms clicking loud in the quiet yard. Daisy hadn't even flinched. She hadn't raised a hand to defend herself. She simply stood on the portico, leaning on the brass hound of her cane, watching her husband gasp for air. "Let him breathe, James," she said quietly. Linfield eased the pressure, though he kept his grip tight on Ronald's coat. Ronald sagged against the carriage, coughing violently, tasting mud and cheap gin in the back of his throat. "I am a duke," Ronald wheezed, spit flying from his lips. "You cannot touch me. I am a captain in His Majesty's army. Currently acting under the direct authority of the Ministry of War, Linfield replied smoothly. And you just attempted to assault the Crown's primary military supplier on Crown-protected grounds. I could have you shot for sabotage and sleep soundly tonight. Do not test me again. Linfield shoved him away. Ronald stumbled, falling to his knees in the wet gravel. The mud soaked instantly through his trousers. He looked up. Daisy was looking down at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating. That was what terrified Ronald the most. If she were screaming, if she were crying and demanding apologies, he could manage her. He understood hysteria. He knew how to manipulate a broken heart. But there was no heart left in her gaze. She looked at him the way Higgins looked at a rotten fence post. "Bring him inside, Captain," Daisy said, turning her back on him. She limped slowly, methodically through the heavy oak doors. "Let him drip on the tiles." Ronald was hauled to his feet by Linfield and marched up the steps. The foyer was warm, smelling of beeswax and wood smoke. Ronald shivered violently. He remembered this hallway. It used to echo with his heavy footsteps, his demands for brandy. Now it was utterly foreign. "The study," Linfield ordered, pointing down the hall. Ronald walked. He felt like a prisoner marching to the gallows. He stepped into the study and stopped. The room had been transformed. The velvet curtains and gilded mirrors he remembered were gone. The walls were lined with raw pine bookshelves, crammed with ledgers, veterinary texts and military manuals. The air smelled of oiled leather and strong black tea. Daisy was already sitting behind a massive, battered oak desk. A fire roared in the hearth behind, casting a warm golden halo around her cropped hair. She did not offer him a chair. She simply pointed to a single, straight-backed wooden stool positioned in front of the desk. Ronald sat. The wood was hard. He was shivering so badly his teeth clicked together. "What do you want?" Ronald asked. His voice was a pathetic whisper. "You have my debts, you have my ruin. Call the bailiffs. Have it done." Daisy opened a leather folio on her desk. She withdrew a single sheet of heavy parchment, covered in dense legal script. She dipped a steel-nibbed pen into a pot of ink and set it gently beside the paper. "I don't want you in the fleet, Ronald," she said, her voice perfectly level. "The fleet is full of men who failed. You didn't fail. You threw it away. Prison is too democratic for you." "Then what?" She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I want you to cease to exist." The fire popped, a loud crack in the heavy silence of the study. Ronald stared at the parchment resting on the desk. He couldn't read the script from where he sat, but the heavy red wax seal at the bottom told him it was absolute. "Cease to exist," Ronald repeated, the words feeling thick and clumsy on his tongue. "You plan to murder me then? Have your pet dragoon put a bullet in my head and bury me under the manure pile?" Captain Linfield, standing by the door with his arms crossed over his scarlet tunic, let out a soft snort of amusement. "Bullets cost a shilling, Your Grace," Linfield said. "You aren't worth the lead." Daisy ignored the officer. She kept her eyes locked on Ronald. "Murder is loud, Ronald, and it leaves a mess. I despise messes. What I am offering is a legal death, a total erasure of your rights over my life, my property, and my person." She tapped a finger against the parchment. "This is a formal deed of separation, drawn up by the Chancery Court. It severs my financial and legal obligations to you and yours to me. It transfers the deed of Ashbourne permanently into the Crown Trust. You surrender all claims to the land, the horses, and the revenue." Ronald gripped the edges of the wooden stool. "I cannot sever the entailment. The title remains yours," Daisy cut in sharply. "You will die the Duke of Westford, but you will die a duke with no land, no London estate, and no voice. In exchange for your signature on this document, the Trust will forgive the £80,000 you owe. We will not pursue legal action. We will not send you to the fleet." Ronald's shoulders dropped fractionally. The crushing weight of the debt eased, just a fraction. "Forgiveness. Don't confuse pragmatism with mercy," Daisy said coldly. "If you sign this, you also agree to permanent exile. You will board a ship in Southampton on Tuesday. You will go to Florence or Naples, I don't care where, so long as it is not England. The trust will pay you an allowance of £300 a year. It will be dispensed monthly by a local bank. If you return to English soil, the allowance stops, the debt is instantly reinstated, and Captain Linfield will personally arrest you. £300, Ronald choked, his aristocratic pride flaring up through his terror. That is a beggar's wage. I cannot maintain a household on £300. I cannot even maintain a carriage. Then walk, Daisy said. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Ronald stared at her. He looked at the heavy brass-headed cane resting against the side of her desk. He looked back at her face, searching for a trace of the woman who had once begged him to stay by her bedside, while the bones in her leg ground together in agony. "You hate me," Ronald whispered. It wasn't a question. Daisy leaned back in her chair. The firelight caught the sharp planes of her face. Hate requires energy, Ronald. Hate requires a pulse. I don't have the luxury of hating you. I have 50 cavalry mounts to deliver by September. She stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She did not reach for her cane. She braced her hands on the desk, bearing her weight on her good leg. "Do you know what happened the night I arrived here?" she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I dragged myself from the driveway to the front door. It took me 10 minutes. Every step felt like a hot iron driving through my spine. I lay on the floor of the foyer, freezing, and I prayed to die. I prayed that my heart would just stop so I wouldn't have to take another step." Ronald swallowed hard. He couldn't look away from her. "But I didn't die," Daisy continued. She slowly walked around the desk. Her gait was heavily lopsided, a violent rolling limp. She stopped 2 feet from him. "I woke up. I put on canvas trousers. I shoveled horse manure. I delivered foals with my bare hands in the freezing mud. I rebuilt this estate bone by broken bone." She reached out and tapped the center of his chest with one calloused, unyielding finger. "You broke me, Ronald. You shattered my leg because you were drunk and impatient, and then you threw me away because you couldn't bear to look at what you had done. But you did me the greatest favor of my life. You removed the velvet cage. You forced me to become a monster. And this monster is going to outlive you." She turned, limped back to the desk, and picked up the steel pen. She held it out to him. "Sign the paper, Ronald. Take your £300 and rot in Italy, or refuse, and I will have you locked in the fleet by midnight. I leave the choice entirely to you." Ronald looked at the pen. He looked at Linfield, who was watching him with a predator's calm. He looked at Daisy, standing tall in her riding clothes, a duchess in name, but a warlord in reality. His hand shook violently as he reached out. His fingers brushed hers. Her skin was rough, hard as saddle leather, and warm with life. His own skin felt cold and damp. He took the pen. He pulled the parchment toward him, the scratch of the steel nib agonizingly loud in the quiet room. He signed his name. Ronald Pendleton, Duke of Westford. He dropped the pen. The ink pooled slightly at the end of his signature. "It's done," Ronald whispered, standing up. His legs felt like lead. He had nothing left. He was a ghost in his own life. "Are you satisfied?" Daisy looked at the signature. She carefully sprinkled sand over the wet ink, blew the excess away, and slid the parchment into a drawer. She locked it with a heavy brass key. "Linfield," she said, not looking up. "Have a fresh horse saddled for the carriage driver. Escort His Grace to the property line. Ensure he does not stop until he reaches York." "Yes, Your Grace," Linfield said. He stepped forward, grabbing Ronald firmly by the elbow. "Time to go." Ronald didn't fight him. He let himself be turned toward the door. But as he reached the threshold, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Daisy was already opening a massive leather ledger, tracing her finger down a column of breeding numbers. She was completely absorbed in the work. She had already forgotten he was there. The door closed behind him, the heavy click of the latch sealing his tomb. The true test of a cavalry horse is not the parade ground. It is the smell of open artillery fire. 2 years after Ronald signed his own ghost into existence, the letters began arriving from the continent. They were not neatly penned missives on perfumed stationery. They were hastily scrawled dispatches from the front lines, written on coarse paper stained with gunpowder and tea. Colonel James Linfield brought them to Ashbourne himself. He rode into the yard on a blistering August afternoon. The mud of Yorkshire had baked into pale, cracked terracotta. He dismounted his heavy bay, tossed the reins to a broadly shouldered young man who used to be a scrawny boy named Pip, and walked straight into the stables. He found Daisy in the far stall. She was running a block of pumice over the hindquarters of a yearling, smoothing out a patch of winter coat that refused to shed. She wore a simple linen shirt, sweat pasting the collar to her neck. Her cane was hooked over the stall door. Linfield didn't say a word. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his tunic and held it out. Daisy stopped brushing. She wiped her hands on her canvas trousers, unhooked her cane, and limped out into the corridor. She took the dispatch. It was a casualty report from a brutal, muddy skirmish near the Spanish border. 3 squadrons of the King's Heavy Dragoons had been ambushed by light artillery. Panic should have decimated them. Horses, by their nature, are prey animals. When the cannons fire, the instinct is to scatter. Daisy read the tight, cramped handwriting of a cavalry commander. We sustained heavy volleys. The French lines anticipated a rout. The standard remounts broke, taking their riders into the tree line. The Ashbourne Greys did not break. They held the formation. Even when bleeding, they moved forward on command. We rallied behind them and broke the artillery line. I owe my life to a gelding named Ironclad. Daisy read the paragraph twice. She slowly lowered the paper. Ironclad, she murmured. He was Nellie's 3rd foal. He had a crooked blaze. He took a piece of shrapnel to the shoulder, Linfield said quietly. The surgeons dug it out. He was back under saddle 3 days later. The general is calling them the Ashbourne Irons. The War Office doesn't want 50 head next year, Daisy. They want 80, and they are willing to double the per-head bounty. Daisy looked down the long, immaculate corridor of the stables. 50 massive stalls, housing the finest bloodstock in the British Empire. They had built an assembly line of survival. She handed the letter back to Linfield. Tell the War Office they will have 80, but I will not double the breeding rate of the mares. I will not break my foundation stock to meet a quota. They will wait for the spring foaling, or they will buy inferior meat from someone else. Linfield smiled. It was a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his weathered face. I told them you would say that. He fell into step beside her as they walked toward the main house. The rhythm of their walking was deeply familiar now. Linfield instinctively slowed his long military stride to match the heavy, rolling drag of her right leg. He never offered his arm. He knew better. In the study, Higgins had left a tray with 2 crystal tumblers and a bottle of peat-smoked Scottish whiskey. It was their ritual. Daisy poured the drinks. Her hands, rough with calluses and permanently scarred from a dozen rope burns and biting colts, gripped the heavy crystal with steady precision. She handed Linfield a glass and sat heavily in her leather chair, stretching her ruined leg toward the unlit hearth. The dull ache was a permanent companion. It flared in the damp, it burned in the cold, and it throbbed when she was exhausted. She drank the whiskey neat. The burn was clean. You look tired, Bee, Linfield said softly, sitting opposite her. I am running a military asset, James. Fatigue is the currency. Linfield swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The foundation is overflowing. The trust has accrued more capital than the Duke's estate ever held. You could hire a manager. You could move to a townhouse in York. You don't have to shovel the stalls yourself. Daisy looked at the brass hound's head of her cane, resting against her thigh. If I leave the dirt, I forget what it feels like to be buried in it, she said flatly. The moment I put on a silk dress and sit in a parlour, I am the Duchess of Westford again. A fragile, broken thing to be pitied. Here, I am the architect. She met his eyes. Linfield held her gaze. There was a profound, unspoken weight between them. It wasn't romance. Romance was for poets and fools. It was an absolute, unbreakable alliance forged in blood, mud, and survival. He had seen her covered in afterbirth. She had seen him violently restrain a man. They knew exactly what the other was capable of. "To the architect, then," Linfield said, raising his glass. Daisy tapped her glass against his. "To the Irons." The letter from Florence arrived in November, bundled with the grain invoices. It was a cheap, thin piece of paper, folded unevenly and sealed with the wax stamp of the British consulate. Daisy sat at her desk, the wind howling against the thick glass of the study windows. She opened it with a silver letter opener. "To the trustees of the Ashbourne Foundation. It is my duty to inform you that Ronald Pendleton, Duke of Westford, succumbed to a fever of the liver on the 14th of this month. He passed in a boarding house on the Via Ghibellina. As he carried no assets, save a modest monthly bank draft, he was buried in the municipal cemetery. His personal effects, a silver pocket watch and 2 tailored coats, were sold to cover his final medical debts. Please advise if the Crown wishes to repatriate the remains." Daisy stared at the words. Fever of the liver. A polite diplomatic translation for drinking oneself to death in a foreign gutter. There was no sudden rush of closure. The sky did not open. The thunder did not crash. There was only the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Ronald was dead. The man who had shattered her leg, stripped her of her dignity, and abandoned her to rot in a freezing, empty house was in the dirt. He had died exactly as he had lived, a pathetic, hollow vessel of a man, stripped of his title's armour. She did not feel joy. She felt nothing. The space inside her where the rage used to burn was already occupied by ledgers, by the smell of alfalfa, by the sharp whinny of newborn foals. Ronald had ceased to matter years ago. This letter was just a clerical formality. Daisy picked up a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped her pen in the ink. "To the British Consul, Florence. The Foundation declines repatriation. Leave him where he lies." She signed it, sealed it, and tossed it into the outbound mail tray. Then she opened her ledger and began calculating the winter oat yield. The following spring, the muddy road leading to Ashbourne did not host a hired hackney, nor a solitary dragoon captain. It hosted a procession. 4 matched Cleveland bays pulled a massive, lacquered carriage bearing the royal crest of the House of Hanover. They were flanked by 20 outriders of the King's Guard, their breastplates gleaming like mirrors under the pale Yorkshire sun. The procession rolled through the black iron gates. They did not stop at the gatehouse. The dragoons on duty snapped crisp salutes, holding their muskets rigid. Daisy stood on the gravel driveway. She wore a tailored riding habit of dark navy wool, severe and impeccably cut. She leaned on her cane. Higgins stood to her left, wearing his best Sunday coat. Pip stood to her right, holding the halter of vengeance. The great grey stallion was 17 hands of pure, explosive power, his coat dappled silver, his eyes taking in the royal carriage with arrogant calm. The carriage stopped. The door opened and the folding steps were lowered. A man stepped out. He was older, heavy-set, wearing the medals of a field marshal over a dark uniform. It was the Duke of York, Commander-in-Chief of the forces. He walked toward Daisy. His entourage hovered nervously behind him. Daisy did not curtsy. Her leg would not allow it, and her pride would not entertain it. She simply inclined her head, a shallow, respectful nod. "Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the stomping of the carriage horses. The Duke of York stopped in front of her. He looked at her cane. He looked at the calluses on her hands. Then he looked past her to the paddocks, where 80 deep-chested, magnificent horses grazed under the watchful eyes of the stable hands. "The King sends his regards, Your Grace," the Duke said. His voice was gravelly, carrying the authority of the throne. "And the gratitude of a nation. They say an army marches on its stomach, but it fights on its horses. Your bloodline held the centre at Salamanca." "They are bred to hold the centre, sir," Daisy replied evenly. The Duke stepped closer to Vengeance. The stallion tossed his massive head, snorting loudly. The Duke didn't flinch. He simply reached out and firmly patted the thick, muscled neck. "He is magnificent," the Duke murmured. The War Office wants to buy the estate outright. Name your price, Duchess. The Crown will pay it. Daisy tightened her grip on the brass hound of her cane. She looked at the sprawling stone house she had resurrected. She looked at Higgins, who had stayed when the money ran out. She looked at the mud under her boots, the mud she had crawled through to deliver life when her own was supposed to be over. Ashbourne is not for sale, Your Royal Highness, Daisy said. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed the density of iron. The foundation will continue to supply the crown. But the land, the bloodline, and the gates remain mine. The Duke of York turned back to look at her. For a long moment, the commander of the British Army studied the crippled, discarded Duchess. He saw the cold, unyielding fire in her eyes. He gave a slow, respectful nod. I pity the man who ever thought you were weak, Your Grace. He is dead, sir, Daisy said flatly. And I am still here. She turned away from the royal carriage, away from the glittering medals and the pomp of London. She limped heavily back toward the stables, the brass tip of her cane striking the Yorkshire stone with the steady, unstoppable rhythm of a heartbeat. Some people are broken by the dark, and some use the dark to forge themselves into iron. Daisy didn't just survive the mud, she built an empire on top of it. If you love this story of ruthless survival and absolute vengeance, hit that like button. Share this with someone who knows what it means to rebuild their life from absolute zero. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you never miss another story of those who refuse to stay buried. We'll see you in the next one.